Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you have not yet subscribed, please do subscribe and join a part of this channel and the community that we are growing here on YouTube. You all really are enjoying this new series, True Crime Thursdays, and I'm super excited about that. Last week, we got a ton of emails of different cases that you guys wanted me to cover. However, one came in first, and it was the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Now, this is a very interesting case, another one that did sweep the nation because of the details that are involved in this case. This case, again, does involve betrayal, a lot of things to be uncovered, and just like the sheriff who investigated this case would say on the news, what you see isn't always what it appears. That is exactly the best way to describe this case. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into episode number 2 of True Crime Thursdays, the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard and the trial of Gypsy Rose Blanchard.
Let's switch this up.
Now, per usual, all my resources are going to be linked down in the description box of this video. Gypsy Rose was born on July 27th, 1991 to her mother Dee Dee and her father Rod Blanchard. Dee Dee and Rod would divorce in early 1991. Their marriage was under some strange circumstances as well. They had not been together long. You see, Dee Dee was 24 when she met Rod. Rod was a 17-year-old high school student. And this is something that I did not see. I'm not gonna really dive into The Act on Hulu, which is a series that you can go watch that does cover this case. But just like a lot of series that Hulu and other streaming services come out with, they do twist the narrative a little bit to make it a little bit more entertaining. So I'm only going to be sticking to the actual facts. This is a quote by Rod Blanchard. He said, quote, "I woke up on my birthday, on my 18th birthday, and realized I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I wasn't in love with her, really. I knew I got married for the wrong reasons," end quote. Now, when they got married, Dee Dee was already pregnant. They had only been together for 6 short months before tying the knot. And Dee Dee, like I said, got pregnant very early on. Then in July of 1991, Gypsy Rose would be born. When this case come to be, authorities were unsure of what Gypsy's actual birth date was. It wasn't until this actually went to trial that Gypsy Rose's actual birthday was released to the general public. Gypsy was lied to about her age by her mother Dee Dee her entire life. It came to light later in trial that Dee Dee actually did falsify Gypsy's current birth certificate. Now, I say current because Gypsy and Dee Dee would, at the time of Gypsy's birth, would reside in Louisiana. It would not be until Hurricane Katrina that they would leave Louisiana. And this is a big part of this story because this is how Dee Dee was able to pull off everything that she was able to pull off. Unaware of this whole thing, Dee Dee had Munchausen's by proxy. I'm going to have the definition on the screen, but Munchausen syndrome by proxy is a mental illness and a form of child abuse. The caretaker of a child, most often the mother, either makes up fake symptoms or causes real symptoms to make it look like the child is sick. This is something that Dee Dee Blanchard most definitely had. Upon Gypsy's birth, there was nothing medically wrong with Gypsy. The only thing that is actually medically recorded was that Gypsy was slightly premature. There's even videos in The Act and that have been on other documentaries of Gypsy like setting up in a basket and like full on talking, and she's very young, like not even a year old yet. Like she was very smart and very active and a healthy baby girl. However, Dee Dee started to put these illnesses on Gypsy at a very early age. Very early on in Gypsy's life, Dee Dee would claim that Gypsy had asthmatic problems, and she feared that she had sight problems, and she had hearing problems. So all of this was already coming to play. And in 1996, that would be the first time that Dee Dee Blanchard would claim that Gypsy Rose could not walk. Now, the actual incident that happened is Gypsy was riding a motorcycle and she skinned her knee. Now, Gypsy was very young. At this point, she would have been around 4 or 5 years old. And she's riding on a motorcycle with her uncle. She skins her knee. Dee Dee takes Gypsy to the actual emergency room. Not that I'm trying to like side with Dee Dee or anything, but if my child was in any type of accident, I would still have them taken to the emergency room to be checked out. But Dee Dee takes her to the emergency room, and then after this, she would tell Rod and Gypsy and everyone that Gypsy could no longer walk. After this motorcycle accident, or Gypsy falling off of the motorcycle, not long after that, that's when Dee Dee would start to claim that, you know, Gypsy had muscular dystrophy and that she would eventually be completely paralyzed from the waist down. And Gypsy was young and she was a child. So, of course, as a child, you're going to trust what your mother is telling you. I mean, to this day, fully a grown woman, I trust my mother completely. You know what I'm saying? So even if my mom was to tell me to this day something, I would still believe my mother to this day. You know what I'm saying? So you also have to understand, like, Gypsy was a child when she was told this information. Several family members would question Dee Dee very early on, including Gypsy's uncle, because Gypsy would be sought pushing her cousins around in her wheelchair at a young age, and she would be seen jumping on a trampoline with her cousin. And anytime early on that Dee Dee was questioned about it, and she would say, you know, sometimes she can and sometimes she can't. It just, you know, depends. But Gypsy would say in interrogation and in trial that eventually she would start getting very, very harsh punishments if she didn't use her walker or the chair. And it said that there was a shed in Dee Dee and Gypsy's backyard. When they moved to the new home, which we'll get into that in a moment, there was a shed in that backyard, and that shed was where Gypsy would be taken if Dee Dee caught her out of her chair or not using her walker to get around. In 2001, that is when Gypsy first was treated for her muscular dystrophy, despite having negative test results. Doctors at Tulane University Hospital tested Gypsy for muscular dystrophy. Though the test results came back negative, Dee Dee continued to tell the other doctors Gypsy suffered from the disease. Dee Dee fabricated Gypsy's medical records, claiming that the real records were gone due to flooding during Hurricane Katrina. Few doctors wanted to contest her claim. Only one pediatric neurologist, Bernardo Flasterstein, noted that Gypsy's weakness was not characteristic of muscular dystrophy. Doctors carried out surgeries on Gypsy for supposed weakness in her eye muscles, among other operations, including a feeding tube installation, salivary gland removal, and teeth extractions. Teeth extractions were done on Gypsy at a young age as well, because she was being treated for having epilepsy, and she lost all of her teeth. Matter of fact, Gypsy has full dentures, top and bottom, to this day because of her being treated for epilepsy when she did not have it. She was also went under surgery for a feeding tube, and she had surgeries on her eyes. She also wore hearing aids, and she had multiple surgeries over her muscular dystrophy. Many people wondered how this was able to go on for 23 years. And what seems to be the key factor here is when they were in Louisiana, when Gypsy was young, They lived there until Hurricane Katrina, and then that's when they would move to a different state. When they moved, all of Gypsy's medical records were destroyed, according to Dee Dee. In August 2005 is when Dee Dee and Gypsy arrive at a special needs shelter following Hurricane Katrina. Dee Dee presented photos of their doomed apartment and claimed that flooding had ruined all of Gypsy's medical records. Shelter doctor Jeanette Jordan cried when she saw Gypsy, to which the young girl responded, quote, "It's okay, you're only human," end quote. Dr. Jordan suggested the pair move to Missouri, where they caught the media's attention when Habitat for Humanity built them a wheelchair ramp in front of their new Springfield, Missouri home. The pair also accepted free trips to Disney World, a specialized car for wheelchairs, and gifts from the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Gypsy told local Ozarks news outlet, quote, "Love is stronger than any hurricane," end quote. After Hurricane Katrina, they're told and advised by a doctor to go to Springfield, Missouri, because in Missouri, Gypsy could be treated a lot cheaper than what it was costing for her to be treated. And at the time, Louisiana didn't have the resources because Hurricane Katrina had just happened. So that's what Dee Dee did. She packed up Gypsy and they moved to Springfield. The community, if you watch any interviews, this community really hovered around Dee Dee and Gypsy, and they really loved them and wanted to protect them and wanted them to be safe and wanted them to have a home. And so that's what they did. The community got together with Habitat for Humanity and built Dee Dee and Gypsy a home. They also put a wheelchair ramp on this home. Dee Dee would receive a van that was accessible for Gypsy's wheelchair. At this point, Gypsy was in a motorized chair full time, and Gypsy stated that if she was caught out of the wheelchair, she would be yelled at. Her mother would tell her that she wished she had an abortion and that she was a mistake and that Gypsy ruined her life, and so on and so forth. Gypsy said that she had started to kind of realize, I think I'm okay. But she didn't know that. You got to remember, at this point as well, this is the first time, around 2005 as well, is when Dee Dee would also inform Gypsy that she had leukemia, that she had cancer. You have to understand that Gypsy's thinking, okay, well, eventually I'm going to die anyways. My mom's told me that. And keep in mind as well, Gypsy's being treated for this stuff. Like, there's photos from the crime scene of the medicine cabinet where all of Gypsy's medications were kept. This girl was being treated for a shitload. Like, that medicine cabinet was a full-on pantry that you would, like, put all of your food in your kitchen. Huge pantry, okay? Gypsy's getting her hair shaved bald, and her mother informed her, this was in testimony, Gypsy would be asked, like, what happened to your hair? And her mother told her, you know, we're going to shave your hair off. That way, you know, you don't have to worry about having little blotches of missing hair. Celebrities that are donating to Gypsy's, you know, surgeries and donating to Gypsy's Make-A-Wish. And she's going to Disney World and catching flights. Dee Dee is winning awards, humanitarian awards for mothering her sick daughter. All kinds of shit. Like, this was fraud to the fullest extent. Gypsy claims around the age 19, she started to put pieces together that she didn't believe that she was as sick as her mother had painted the picture that she was, but she wasn't sure. Gypsy was brainwashed from the moment she was born. So there's no real true telling like what all Dee Dee told Gypsy. It wasn't until 2007 that Bernardo Flasterstein, the one that I mentioned earlier, he was a pediatric neurologist. And that is the first time that Munchausen's by proxy was mentioned in the notes of Gypsy's doctor's appointment. This is also the only doctor that would ever note anything weird in Gypsy and Dee Dee's situation. Dr. Flasterstein would note that, quote, though Dee Dee has insisted that Gypsy has muscular dystrophy, the girl's weaknesses aren't characteristic of the disease. There is a strong possibility of Munchausen's by proxy with the mother, maybe by some underlying unknown etiology to explain for her symptoms, end quote. Other doctors didn't catch Dee Dee's lies. They continued to take her word for it. There was even one doctor, which was Robert Beckerman, that described Gypsy and Dee Dee as his favorite patients. They were featured in the doctor's newsletter for that doctor. So for his whole entire, he had like a newsletter for all of his patients. Gypsy and Dee Dee were featured in it. Gypsy and Dee Dee were on the news. And in all of these interviews, and this is spoke about in Hulu's The Act as well, you will see Dee Dee holding Gypsy's hand in every interview. Gypsy would testify later that the reason that Dee Dee held her hand like that was that so she could squeeze it when Gypsy was saying something wrong. It's just so sad to me that this went on for over 2 decades and nobody stepped in to help this little girl. I do just want to say Rod, the dad, because he's mentioned in all interviews. He has him and his new wife. They go and visit Gypsy currently in prison. They have plans to get Gypsy's life together when she's out of prison. I know a lot of people are really quick to say, well, why didn't the father, you know, get second opinions? Why didn't he fight for this? And I did find in my research that there was actually a court hearing in the early 2000s between Dee Dee and Rod over Gypsy. And Dee Dee had told and threatened Rod, allegedly, that if he continued to push buttons and ask questions and, you know, get in the way of their daughter's health, that she would not allow any contact with Rod. Now, keep in mind, Gypsy and Rod's contact through the years was basically none anyways. Anytime that Rod would try to call and speak to Gypsy, Dee Dee would give some excuse, and Gypsy was not allowed to speak to Rod unless Dee Dee was in the room. So you have to understand, this was basically like a imprisonment. Her mother had imprisoned her, lied to her about her age, and at this moment, Gypsy feels that there is no escape. She's afraid that if she does voice her concerns to a doctor, they're just going to go to her mom. The punishment's going to be unbearable. It's just going to be not worth it. Fast forward to 2009. Now, this is when the neighbors in Springfield and the friends of Dee Dee and Gypsy would start to get suspicious. The Springfield Police Department would receive a call in 2009 expressing doubts of Gypsy's health issues. Now, this was an anonymous caller. I'm gonna read from you what the actual officer put in here. So this was reported, like I said, in 2009. And when the officer goes to the home, Dee Dee makes up this elaborate scheme that the reason why Gypsy's medical records weren't connecting was because she was afraid of Rod. She was fearful of Rod. She didn't know what Rod was capable of. The officer, after looking at Gypsy's identification, at the time, Dee Dee had informed Gypsy and everyone that at this time in 2009, that Gypsy was 14 years old. However, after the officer looks at Gypsy's identification, he records that she's actually 18 at the time. Gypsy does suffer from some type of mental handicap, end quote. 2010, she was suspect about her health. She was suspect about everything. She was starting to get older. And at the time, in 2010, she was told that she was 15 years old, okay? Gypsy's like, I don't know about this. This just does not make sense. I've had periods for years and years and years. How am I only 15 years old? So she starts to ransack the house. And in this, Gypsy finds her Medicaid card. And on her Medicaid card would have her actual birth date. And that is when Gypsy would realize that she was 19 and not 15 years old. February 2011. Person has remained unnamed. I have not been able to find his name in anything. If someone can find his name in some type of article or anything, feel free to leave it in the comments and I'll pin it. But Gypsy was very much into comic books, fairy tales, okay? She was very much into sci-fi, things like that. She loved to dress up and wear wigs and be a princess. And that is something that's going to be very important through the rest of this, is Gypsy's idea of fairy tales. She thought that everything had a happily ever after moment, okay? And Gypsy was waiting for her moment to be a princess. Gypsy went to a sci-fi convention. And at this convention, she would meet this 35-year-old man. At the time, Gypsy believed that she was 15. After everything, Gypsy finding her Medicaid card, her mother explained to her that that was incorrect, that she was really 15 years old, and had convinced Gypsy that she was 15 years old. This is an important part of the story of Gypsy Rose. Gypsy, her whole life, had been shown these Disney movies of these Disney princesses with these fairy tale endings, and she was very much into that. She was into princesses, and she was into comic books, and she was into anime, and she was into all of these things. And so routinely, Dee Dee would take Gypsy to these conventions. Now, at the time, Gypsy was actually 19 years old. Keep that in mind. However, Dee Dee was telling her she was 15. Go to this sci-fi convention. Gypsy would meet this man who was 35 years old at a sci-fi convention. They would begin speaking to one another online, and eventually Gypsy would escape her mother's care in February of 2011 and would go and stay with this man in a hotel. Eventually, Dee Dee found out where Gypsy was, and she went to the hotel with paperwork and showed this man that Gypsy was a minor and was only 15 years old. And this man did believe Dee Dee, and Gypsy left back with her mother. That was the closest that Gypsy ever got to actually leaving her mother's care. When they would return back home, Dee Dee would go into a fit of rage. She would bust their home computer, and she would tell Gypsy, quote, "If you ever try to do that again, I'm going to smash your fingers with a hammer," end quote. After that, Dee Dee would eventually purchase a new computer, but Gypsy was only allowed to use the computer under supervision of Dee Dee. In 2013, Gypsy would be sneaking on a Christian dating website, and she would eventually become involved in an online relationship with a man by the name of Nicholas Goldie John. Goldie John would very soon after he and Gypsy meet, he would eventually be arrested in a McDonald's for pleasuring himself while watching porn on his phone. He also introduced sexual things to Gypsy as well, such as kinks. He had told Gypsy that he was several different people. He believed that he was a 500-year-old vampire. Gypsy posed with knives and post these risque statuses to fake Facebook accounts. Her mother wouldn't find out about these accounts. In one of those Facebook posts, Gypsy would write, quote, "I'm embracing my role and duties. I live and breathe to serve my master," end quote. So a lot of these different kinks and roles and people that Nick had within him, he would say, Gypsy would correspond with different characters as well. There would be a vampire character, there would be Candy, there was all these different characters that she would reciprocate and act like to please Nick Goldie John. In early 2015, so 2 years after the pair start talking, they come up with this elaborate plan for them to somehow accidentally meet. Gypsy and Dee Dee had tickets to go and see the premiere of the movie Cinderella. Gypsy's idea to have Nick come to Springfield and for them to mysteriously bump into one another and for them to be able to start up a relationship from that point. However, that's not how things would go. It didn't work out at all. Gypsy's mother, Dee Dee, just completely was like, absolutely not. Come on, let's watch the movie. And Gypsy would end up excusing herself during the movie, and she would be taken to the handicap bathroom at the movie theater where she and Nick Godejohn would have sex in a handicap stall. So I want you to put yourself for a second in this position as being very closed off to reality. And you've been lied to your whole life and told that you have all of these diseases, deathly diseases. You've been shaved bald. You have no idea of an actual life, no clue of what actual reality is. And so the internet comes along, and you now are in talks with this guy. Your first experience, you believe in all these fairy tales and fairy tale princesses and fairy tale endings and happily ever afters. And your first experience with the opposite sex is to be taken into a handicapped stall bathroom and had sex with. After this movie theater, Dee Dee would become specula of Gypsy and Nick already knowing one another. She had suspicions of him, and she forbade Gypsy from ever seeing Godejohn ever again. However, this was going to be the beginning of the end for Dee Dee, because in this turn of events of Plan A, which you guys will know more about what that means in a minute, didn't work, and Plan B was something that Nick Godejohn was not okay with, it was now relevant that they were going to have to move forward with Plan C. In the numerous texts and messages exchanged between Gypsy and Nick, they were trying to come up with something for them to be able to be together. They come up with 3 different plans amongst the 2 of them. Plan A was for them to accidentally bump into one another at a movie theater and be able to begin a relationship off from there. Plan A did not work. Plan B was for Gypsy to get pregnant. And she felt that if she got pregnant, that Dee Dee would allow Nick to be in the picture. I think that would have never happened, but that's what Gypsy believed. And Nick was not into that idea whatsoever. He did not want to get pregnant. So that plan went out the window. And Plan C was to kill Dee Dee and run away together. So this is when they would start to plan out the slaying of Dee Dee Blanchard. Now, they had discussed different means of murdering Dee Dee: arson, poisoning her mother, using a gun. But in the end, they decided to go with killing her mother with a knife and stabbing her mother. This would not be learned until the trial, but Gypsy would take hundreds of dollars, pretty much thousands of dollars, from Dee Dee's custody to pay for Nick Godejohn to travel to Springfield. It would also pay for a knife, well, was supposed to, but ended up, Gypsy stole the knife from a Walmart, paid for hotel rooms and bus tickets. In the wee hours of June 10th, 2015, Nick Godejohn would come into the home. Gypsy did leave the door unlocked. He would put Gypsy into the bathroom and lock the door, where he would then go into Dee Dee's bedroom and would stab her 17 times. Her head was basically severed. It was a brutal, 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 brutal murder. Gypsy would later testify that she heard her mother screaming, asking for help, calling for Gypsy. Gypsy just continued to hide in the bathroom with her hands over her ears. This is a quote that Gypsy would later testify. Quote, "You think hearing a slaying is like what you hear on a horror film or something, but it's really not. You can stand watching a horror film, but hearing someone actually being slain is terrifying. It creates this nauseous feeling in your stomach. All you can think about is how afraid you are." end quote. That is a quote directly from Gypsy. After this, Gypsy and Nick Godejohn would escape to a hotel, a Days Inn in Springfield. They would catch a bus ticket and they would go to Nick Godejohn's. Gypsy would start making these Facebook posts on Dee Dee and Gypsy's joint Facebook account. One of which being, quote, "The bitch is dead." Eventually, there would be a wellness check called on the home on June 14th of 2015. Obviously, after this Facebook post of "the bitch is dead," concerned neighbors and friends of Dee Dee and Gypsy would call the police saying, you know, there's been a concerning Facebook post. And on June 14th of 2015, that is when the police would go to Dee Dee and Gypsy's home, and they would discover Dee Dee being brutally murdered and Gypsy missing without her chair. Now, in the beginning of this, police felt that they were dealing with someone who had murdered Dee Dee and had kidnapped Gypsy, because Facebook posts would continue and they would say, quote, "I raped her daughter." Police start to run the IP address from the Facebook post because they feel like that they're on a manhunt for someone who is raping a disabled minor child. So they traced the IP address to the Facebook of Nicholas Godejohn's home. There, he would stay in a standoff, waving around a gun for a while. And once the police finally did get Nick to surrender himself, they would very quickly discover that Gypsy was there on her own free will. They found wigs of Gypsy, and Gypsy was walking. This is where the world would go into major, you know, you got to imagine the community of Springfield. You know, they've donated all their time and this money to this family, and come to find out Gypsy can walk perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. And the interrogation of Gypsy and Nick happened. I'm not going to include it. In Gypsy's initial interrogation with the police officer, she does say that everything they're saying, she had nothing to do with it. You know, she had no idea her mother was dead, etc., etc. The police officer comes back in and says, look, you know what happened. You know, we have all this evidence, blah, blah, blah. And Gypsy basically says, okay, this is what happened. I'll tell you the truth. And that's when she tells her version of events, which was that Nick put her in the bathroom and locked the door, and he slayed her mother. Nick would also confess to being the one to commit the murder. After this, Gypsy does take a plea deal where she has 10 years, plead guilty to second-degree murder. The prosecutor feared that if they were to have an actual trial with Gypsy and they would actually have a jury, that they would take the fact that Gypsy was basically abused and neglected her whole life and let her off completely. So they offered her a plea deal, second-degree murder, 10 years with the possibility of parole. Matter of fact, Gypsy goes up for parole in 2 short years, people. Nick would then go through interrogation as well, and he would be very upfront and honest pretty quickly and say, I'm just going to tell you the truth. I did stab her mother. Now, in the process of Nick Godejohn's trial, Gypsy was on several interviews, one of which being Dr. Phil.
Tell me what you're thinking right now.
I wish I wouldn't have done any of that. It's hard to see pictures of that house and the memory. And pictures of her in the wheelchair.
Well, was it justice?
No. She didn't deserve what happened. If anything, she just deserved to be where I am.
Did she warp your personality? Did she warp your mind? Did she warp your moral compass?
In the beginning, yes. And through my life, yes. She taught me how to be a good liar. A very good liar without any conscience. And I'm changing that. I'm trying to be a good person now. I don't want to be like my mother and I'm nothing like her.
Trained to lie and steal and cheat and all of that her whole life. Now it's just teaching her how to do the right things and you know, believe in that way of being right and true and trustworthy. But she's still got 6-7 years before she gets out. It's just a lot to choke down, deal with, and digest.
When we found out everything that happened with Dee Dee and with Gypsy, I was furious. I couldn't believe.
And Gypsy did the interview with Dr. Phil. Nick Godejohn hadn't went to trial yet. And this is where the true pictures really starts to come out. And Gypsy really starts to tell what happened behind closed doors for all of those years. And she says that when she was 19 and was being told she was 14, 15, she was starting to question things. And she started getting a little bit more ballsy. She started walking around the house and doing things like that, and being caught online and different things like that. And as punishment, her mother would chain her up to the bed for days, weeks at a time, starve her, all of these things. In the show, The Act, there's even a scene played out that Gypsy talks about in interviews of a time at a birthday party where she tries cake. And her mother freaks out because she has this feeding tube. She's not supposed to have sugar, right? And takes her to the house and gives her these shots and all this stuff. And Gypsy was completely fine after eating that cake. And that's when Gypsy was like, have I been lied to this whole time? And the Dr. Phil interviews is really where Gypsy does seem remorseful, but she does paint a picture of what life with Dee Dee Blanchard was really like.
You got put in a wheelchair, and you were 7 years old, correct?
Yes, sir.
Why did she tell you you were going in the wheelchair?
I did get into a motorcycle accident, and it skinned my knee, and she took me to the hospital and then told me that the doctor gave her a wheelchair, and I have to be in a wheelchair now.
Forever?
Forever. She had me use a walker before the wheelchair.
Did she tell you you had to be on a walker?
She said that I had muscular dystrophy.
But did you feel any different the day before you got the walker than the day you did have the walker?
No, sir.
You were able to run around?
Pretty much, yes.
And would you forget to get it and run into the kitchen?
There would be times that I'd forget to grab it and then go to walk. And then my mom would catch me and be like, use your walker.
Dee Dee about it, and I'm like, she can walk or not? You know, she's gonna be in a wheelchair all her life. And, you know, the answer I got from Dee Dee was, you know, she had a disease she was diagnosed with, and it was going to progressively get worse, and eventually she was going to be bound to the wheelchair at all times.
She tell you when you went out that you were to stay in the wheelchair?
Yes, sir, she would.
But you knew you could walk.
Yes, sir.
Did you ever say to her, Mother, I can walk. Why am I in this wheelchair?
No, sir, I never asked that.
When she wasn't around, did you get up and walk secretly?
I did, yes, sir.
Did she ever catch you walking?
She did a couple times.
And what did she say or do?
She got so upset with me, she would punish me so bad. Like, she started hitting me with a coat hanger and telling me all kinds of mean things. She would tell me that she wished she had an abortion when she had the chance, that I ruined her life, that I have no idea how hard it is to keep up everything she built.
Did you understand that you being sick was necessary to keep up what she built? Because you got a house from Habitat for Humanity, you got donations, you got different things from people for being sick. So that was a source of income for her, right?
It was, yes. And I had no idea that I was a part of that.
You didn't know that you were a cash cow?
No.
Dee Dee got a house from Habitat for Humanity. They would have free trips here and there, free flights. She was getting some money from a couple celebrities. Their life was full of free stuff, I guess, fun stuff.
The Blanchards scammed many different charities and lied to many different charities across the U.S., including churches and support groups.
Dee Dee Blanchard was exaggerating her daughter's medical condition for financial gain.
You were diagnosed with epilepsy about this time as well, right?
Yes, sir.
And so they started giving you Tegretol, and it caused your teeth to crumble.
Yes, sir.
Did you know what was happening at the time?
No, I really didn't. I just didn't understand why my teeth were falling out.
You know now you didn't have epilepsy.
I know now.
You know now you didn't need to be in that wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
You know now she was making all of that up. After you went in the wheelchair, you had a feeding tube inserted.
Yes, sir.
Picture starts being painted. It starts to sweep the nation. After this Dr. Phil interview comes out, people are like, what the right? People are kind of pissed that Gypsy got any time at all, and start to wonder and put themselves in the shoes of Gypsy and what it must have been like to be basically imprisoned in your own home and nothing be able to stop it. Nick Godejohn had not been to court. He had not went to trial. His trial starts to happen, and Gypsy actually testifies on stand for Nick Godejohn.
28-year-old Nicholas Godejohn is accused of murdering Dee Dee Blanchard. Authorities found her dead in a pool of blood in 2015. Among the state's final witnesses, a computer forensic analyst.
One is the search for knives on Walmart.com. That is a specific entry for a specific knife. And eBay.com, that is a search for tasers.
The jury also saw the defendant's jailhouse phone call with a local reporter, where the defendant claimed another side of him took over.
So I did not know what it was capable of until that dark night. Once that night came, I knew fully well what it was capable of. And at that point, there was no time going back, because from the first step I walked into the house, I knew there was no coming back. Unfortunately, I ended up listening to my darker side because I wanted to be with her, and I remember what she said, and I wanted to believe what she was saying, and unfortunately, I should have listened to my other part of me.
The state rested shortly later. Godejohn initially could not decide whether to testify.
I've given it thought.
You don't have to tell me if you're going to now or not. I was just asking if you had enough time to talk with Mr. Perry and Mr. Meade about it.
I might need more.
The defense immediately called Godejohn's girlfriend, Gypsy Blanchard. She talked about her mother's abuse and accepted most of the blame for the murder.
In June of 2015, were you in a wheelchair?
Yes.
Did Nick know you were in a wheelchair?
Yes.
Why were you in a wheelchair in June of 2015?
Because my mother forced me to be in one.
Were you ill during this period of time?
No, sir.
What illnesses did you believe you had?
Cancer, muscular dystrophy. I needed glasses. I needed hearing aids. Seizure disorder. And I can't remember what else.
And what was your mom doing that caused you to be more desperate?
Things were getting physically and more physically abusive. The hitting was more. The starving was more.
How did Nick know when to do this crime, time-wise, that morning?
I told him.
Who planned this murder?
I did.
The state fought back, pushing Gypsy to talk about the defendant's role in the crime.
You mentioned that how the murder was to take place, that was all up to the defendant, correct?
That is correct.
And it was the defendant that told you he wanted to stab your mom.
Correct.
And it was the defendant that told you he wanted a knife.
Yes.
The defendant, since it was his idea on how to kill your mom, he also wanted tape and a taser, correct?
Yes.
And he wanted you to get those items for him.
Yes.
When the defendant agreed to kill your mom, at some point he told you that he also wanted to rape her.
Yes, sir.
You did not want the defendant to rape your mom, correct?
No, sir.
And in fact, in leaving the decision of how to kill her up to the defendant, you never told him to stab her 17 separate times, right?
No.
Oh. And you certainly didn't tell him to cut her neck down to the bone, right?
No.
If convicted, Godejohn faces a possible lifetime behind bars.
Gypsy testifies in court and says it was all my plan. I'm the one. I was getting very, very desperate. The hitting was getting worse. She was starving me. So I presented this to Nick Godejohn. However, after reading text messages and things, the prosecutor was not having it, and he pushes Gypsy even further and says, okay, but you didn't want her stabbed. You didn't want her to be raped. Apparently, Nick Godejohn's dark side that he refers to, a devil and an angel on one side in numerous interviews, he claims that this dark side took over him. And once this dark side took over, that was all. And apparently this dark side wanted to also rape Dee Dee as well. Gypsy did not want that. She asked him not to do that. Gypsy also testifies that Nick would rape her after the murder in her bedroom while her mother was dead in the next room. Very, very, very fucking dark. Eventually, they would come to reach a verdict of guilty for Nick Godejohn. He was guilty of first-degree murder. Now, the defense had already come to terms with Nick being guilty. However, what they were going for in the trial was guilty of second-degree murder for a lessened sentence. And they were hoping that since he had been diagnosed with autism prior to the trial, they were hoping that that was going to get the jury to see it from a different perspective. However, with all of the state's evidence, the prosecutor's evidence, the jury comes back with the guilty verdict, and eventually Nick Godejohn would be sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole.
Anything you'd like to say before I pronounce sentence?
Maybe a little.
Yes, sir.
When this whole thing happened, like I've said it before in my statements, it's very much the truth, so I'll just say it again. When this whole thing happened, all I ever really wanted to be is Blanchard. That's all I ever wanted to be. I've never known what it was like to have a motherly love. I've never known what it's like to have a female connection. I've never known any of that. None of it. Because I've never known it, that's part of the reason why I strive so hard to get it. So much to the point where I don't even understand what it even feels like to have a female connection. It's missing. It's a missing link. It's always been a missing link. It's always been one. And that's the reason why I guess when I got so deep into this situation where I fell in love so deeply, they do say, and they've always said it, love is blind. They've always said that. Well, I'll admit it, I was blindly in love. That was always very much the case. It was always that way. So, I understand that you're a fair judge. I've heard it from both my attorneys. And all I ask is just for mercy, please.
Is what?
Mercy of any form. That's all I ask.
The judge goes to ask Nick Godejohn, is there anything you would like to say before I sentence you? And Nick Godejohn chooses to say, yes, there is something I would like to say. He says that he is guilty. He knows he was in the wrong. But the reason he did what he did is because he was so blindly in love. And he had never been with a woman before. He had never felt this before. And he was doing anything he could to keep that connection with Gypsy. And he felt that in order to keep that relationship, he had to murder her mother. And he asks the judge for mercy of any kind. Just give me mercy. The judge would then, like I said, sentence Nick Godejohn to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gypsy and Nick Godejohn have not had any conversation since arrest. Gypsy has been in another relationship since she was sent to prison.
Has found love behind bars, guys. Listen to this.
Now she believes she's engaged or is getting engaged to yet another guy.
Gypsy Rose Blanchard is engaged. A family friend confirmed the news to us today.
The life of Gypsy Rose Blanchard has been anything but traditional, so why should her romantic relationships be any different? Gypsy thought she had found love, but the man who began as her pen pal ended up breaking her heart. It turns out we aren't the only ones who can't stop keeping up with details concerning the case.
You plead to the Class A felony of murder in the second degree.
Guilty.
While most of us just headed to Wikipedia after catching up on the HBO documentary concerning the case, a man known only as Ken went to the next level. Ken started writing to Gypsy while she was serving her time in prison after learning about her story. The two started out as pen pals, but after a year and a half, they decided to get serious about their relationship. As you can probably imagine, having one half of a couple incarcerated does tend to complicate things. Still, Gypsy and Ken declared that they would be married in January 2020 while Gypsy was still in prison. But sadly, the relationship between these two has now ended. It's no secret Gypsy has a troubled past when it comes to romance. If you've seen Hulu's The Act, then you know what we're talking about. But this time, she truly seemed happy, and her friends and family believed she had finally found a healthy relationship with someone who truly loved her. The two took their relationship slowly, graduating from long letters to in-person visits, so what went wrong? Unlike pretty much every other aspect of Gypsy's life, this is surprisingly not very scandalous. We know we were hoping to sip some delicious tea about the situation too. They called off the engagement because the distance was simply too much for the couple to deal with any longer. Allegedly, both Gypsy and Ken are brokenhearted over the situation, but sadly that doesn't change the reality that Gypsy is going to be in prison for a very long time. As of right now, Gypsy won't even be up for parole until the year 2024, just before she turns 33 years old. While that's obviously a long time for Gypsy, it would also be a long time for Ken to wait for his bride to join him. According to the couple, the decision to call off the engagement was mutual. To those of us on the outside, this may seem like a situation which is easy to judge. Of course, Gypsy couldn't handle having a romantic relationship after everything she's experienced and the fact that she's in prison for the foreseeable future. But it would be a disservice to Gypsy to pretend that she's not capable of love as anyone else. Although Dee Dee did her best to keep her daughter isolated while she was alive, Gypsy now enjoys a close relationship with her father, Rod Blanchard, and her stepmother, Christy. They fully supported Gypsy during her trial and still keep in regular contact with her. Not only did Gypsy fall in love with Ken, but her family did too. She and Ken had planned to exchange wedding rings and begin their life together when Gypsy was released, but sadly that option is no longer on the table. Before Gypsy was imprisoned, she was always fascinated with Disney princesses like so many of us are.
But in Disney movies, everything's a fantasy. It's a fairy tale.
She saw herself as Rapunzel, trapped atop a tower, isolated and ready to be free and get her life started. Now, Gypsy is still imprisoned and no longer has a Prince Charming waiting for her on the other side.
At the end, Mother Gothel died because Rapunzel tried to stand up for herself.
Although it's sad their relationship couldn't go the distance, there's definitely an inspiring silver lining. Being in prison is an understandable obstacle, but this experience gives us hope Gypsy will be able to find happiness once she's free. It's also hopefully a good indication that Gypsy will avoid falling into the type of toxic relationship she had with her last partner, Nick Godejohn. There was a time when she viewed Nick as a way to escape from her old life. The two of them even went to a screening of Cinderella on their first in-person date. But eventually, Gypsy declared he had been as controlling as her mother, just in different ways. Nick has called Gypsy his soulmate and claimed to be betrayed by her actions.
Of course, I will always have feelings for her.
Gypsy getting together with Ken was proof she had put her relationship with Nick behind her. While Gypsy is still going to be in jail for a very long time, Nick is currently serving a life sentence.
There you have it. She gets in a relationship with this guy. They get engaged, okay? And supposed to exchange vows in January of 2020. However, it doesn't work out because of the long distance, which was really hard not only for Gypsy, but for Ken. They do still care about one another. And Gypsy's father and stepmother both really liked Ken as well. However, to this day, from what I've been able to research, they do still keep in contact, but they are no longer a couple. I think once she gets out, I think it'll be a different situation. And she goes out for parole in just a couple short years. So who knows? Who knows what the future is to hold for Miss Gypsy. There you have it, you guys. There is episode 2 of True Crime Thursdays, the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard and the trial of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. I hope you guys did enjoy this episode. Be sure that you do subscribe if you do enjoy it, and hit that like button if you'd like more videos like it. I love you guys, and until the very next time.